In a quiet little town surrounded by green hills and endless fields, there lived a young man named Thomas. He was tall but very thin, with sharp cheekbones and arms that looked like they could barely lift a sack of potatoes. Despite his skinny frame, Thomas had big dreams and a heart full of hope. He wanted nothing more than to find love, build a family, and live a simple yet happy life. But in this small, tight-knit community, people didn't see past his appearance. The women in town often whispered behind his back, saying things like, "He's too weak," or, "How can someone so skinny take care of a family?" These words stung, but what hurt even more was the loneliness that followed. Thomas tried everything he could think of to change their minds. He worked hard at the local bakery, waking up before sunrise to help bake bread and pastries. He joined the church choir, sang his heart out every Sunday, and even volunteered to fix broken fences for neighbors. Yet no matter how much effort he put in, the same comments kept coming back. People would pat him on the back and say, "You're such a nice boy." But when it came to anything serious, like marriage, they dismissed him without a second thought. It was as if being thin made him invisible, unworthy of love or respect. One evening, after another long day of hearing those hurtful remarks, Thomas sat alone in his tiny apartment above the bakery. His room was simple: a bed, a small table, and a chair, but it felt emptier than ever. He stared out the window, watching the sun dip below the horizon, painting the sky orange and pink. For the first time, he allowed himself to cry. Tears rolled down his cheeks as he wondered if he'd ever find someone who would look beyond his size and see the person inside. That night, unable to sleep, Thomas decided to do something drastic. He had heard about mail-order husbands and wives, a way for people to connect with others far away who might be looking for companionship. At first, the idea seemed strange to him. How could you marry someone you'd never met? But as he thought about it more, he realized it might be his only chance. If no one in his town would give him a fair shot, maybe someone elsewhere would. With newfound determination, he lit a candle and began writing letters. The process wasn't easy. Thomas spent hours crafting each letter, trying to sound confident while still being honest about who he was. He described his life in the small town, his job at the bakery, and his dreams of starting a family. He included a photograph of himself, standing awkwardly in front of the bakery, hoping it wouldn't scare anyone away. After weeks of waiting anxiously by the mailbox, he finally received a reply. It was from a woman named Margaret, who lived miles away in a different state. Margaret's letter was unlike anything Thomas had expected. Instead of focusing on appearances or material wealth, she wrote about her own struggles. She explained that she was a widow, left alone to raise 2 children after her husband passed away unexpectedly. Life hadn't been kind to her. She worked long hours on a farm just to make ends meet, and there were days when she didn't know how she'd feed her kids. Yet despite all that, her words radiated warmth and kindness. She thanked Thomas for reaching out and admitted that she, too, had faced judgment from others. "I believe we shouldn't judge a book by its cover," she wrote. "What matters most is what's inside." Reading her words, Thomas felt a spark of hope ignite within him. For the first time, someone seemed genuinely interested in getting to know him, not for his looks or strength, but for who he truly was. He quickly replied, pouring his heart into the letter. Over the next few weeks, their correspondence grew frequent. They shared stories about their lives, their hopes, and their fears. Margaret told him about her children, Emily and Jacob, and how much she missed having someone to share the burdens of life with. Thomas, in turn, opened up about his struggles with loneliness and the pain of feeling rejected. As the days turned into months, Thomas found himself looking forward to Margaret's letters more than anything else. Each envelope carried not just words, but the promise of a new beginning. Finally, after months of exchanging letters, they agreed to meet. Margaret invited him to visit her home, promising to pick him up from the train station. Though nervous, Thomas packed his bags and set off on the journey, unsure of what awaited him but willing to take the risk. When the train pulled into the station, Thomas stepped off, scanning the crowd for Margaret. His heart raced as he spotted her standing near the platform, holding a bouquet of wildflowers. She was shorter than he imagined, with weathered hands and tired eyes that hinted at years of hard work. But her smile, it was warm and inviting, instantly putting him at ease. As they exchanged greetings, Thomas noticed the curious glances from nearby townsfolk. Some stared openly, while others whispered to one another. He braced himself for the inevitable judgment, but Margaret simply took his arm and led him toward her wagon. The ride to her house was quiet, filled with stolen glances and nervous smiles. Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that this meeting was a turning point in his life. Little did he know, the challenges and surprises were only beginning. As the wagon bumped along the dirt road, Thomas couldn't help but feel a mix of excitement and unease. The countryside around them was beautiful, with golden fields stretching as far as the eye could see, and tall trees lining the horizon. But his mind kept drifting back to the stares and whispers at the train station. He wondered if Margaret had noticed them too. She sat beside him, holding the reins loosely in her hands, her face calm but thoughtful. Occasionally she glanced at him, offering a small smile that seemed to say, "Everything will be all right." When they finally arrived at her modest farmhouse, Thomas felt a wave of relief wash over him. The house wasn't grand or fancy. It was simple, with chipped paint on the wooden walls and a sagging porch, but it felt welcoming. A few chickens clucked lazily in the yard, and a vegetable garden stretched out behind the house. It was clear that Margaret worked hard to keep things running, even if life hadn't been kind to her. As he stepped down from the wagon, Emily and Jacob, her two children, peeked shyly from the doorway. Emily, the older of the two, was about 10 years old, with curly brown hair and wide, curious eyes. Jacob, who looked to be around 7, clung tightly to his sister's hand, his expression wary. Margaret introduced them to Thomas, explaining gently that he was here to get to know them all better. The kids nodded politely but didn't say much, their eyes darting between their mother and this strange man who had suddenly appeared in their lives. Thomas knelt down to their level, giving them a warm smile. "Hi there," he said softly. "I'm Thomas. I hope we can be friends." Jacob hid behind his sister, while Emily managed a tiny wave before darting inside. Margaret sighed as she watched her children retreat into the house. "They're just shy," she explained, leading Thomas inside. "It's been hard for them since their father passed away. They haven't had much reason to trust new people." Thomas nodded, understanding more than she realized. He knew what it felt like to be judged or dismissed, and he could see the weight of loss in the way the family moved and spoke. Still, he was determined to win them over, one step at a time. The days that followed were a whirlwind of adjustments for everyone. Margaret showed Thomas around the farm, explaining how things worked and asking for his help with various chores. At first, he struggled. His thin arms weren't used to lifting heavy buckets or swinging an axe, but he refused to give up. Every time he stumbled or made a mistake, he reminded himself why he was here. This wasn't just about proving himself to Margaret. It was about building something real, something meaningful. Meanwhile, the children began warming up to him little by little. One afternoon, while Margaret was busy mending clothes, Thomas decided to try again with Emily and Jacob. He found them sitting under a tree in the yard, playing quietly with stones and sticks. Without saying a word, he joined them, picking up a stick and pretending it was a sword. "Who wants to fight a dragon?" he asked with a playful grin. Emily giggled, grabbing another stick, while Jacob hesitated for a moment before following suit. For the next hour, they laughed and shouted, imagining themselves as brave knights battling imaginary monsters. When Margaret called them in for supper, both kids were smiling, their earlier shyness forgotten. Despite these small victories, not everything went smoothly. That same evening, after dinner, a group of neighbors stopped by uninvited. They were friendly enough at first, chatting casually with Margaret and complimenting her cooking. But when the conversation turned to Thomas, the tone shifted. One woman raised her eyebrows and said loudly, "So, this is your mail-order husband? He doesn't look like he'd last long chopping wood." The room fell silent, the tension thick, enough to cut with a knife. Thomas felt his cheeks burn as the others chuckled nervously, agreeing with her remark. Margaret froze, torn between defending Thomas and avoiding conflict. In the end, she stayed quiet, her lips pressed into a thin line. Thomas saw the hurt in her eyes, but also the fear of being judged herself if she stood up for him. His heart sank. Was this going to be his life here? Would he always be seen as someone unworthy, no matter how hard he tried? The thought weighed heavily on him as the visitors left and the house grew quiet once more. Later that night, unable to sleep, Thomas sat on the porch, staring up at the stars. The cool breeze carried the scent of fresh earth and wildflowers, but it did little to soothe his troubled mind. He replayed the evening's events over and over, wondering if he should leave. Maybe this wasn't the fresh start he had hoped for. Just as he was about to go inside, he heard footsteps behind him. Turning, he saw Margaret standing there, wrapped in a shawl, her face etched with guilt and sadness. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, sitting beside him. "I should have said something tonight. I shouldn't have let them talk about you like that." Her voice trembled, and tears glistened in her eyes. "You've done nothing wrong, Thomas. You've been nothing but kind to me and my children. And yet," she trailed off, shaking her head, "I've spent so many years trying to avoid trouble, trying to survive without rocking the boat. But seeing you tonight, hearing those cruel words, it made me realize I can't keep living like that." Thomas listened silently, touched by her honesty. He reached out and placed a hand on hers. "Thank you for apologizing," he said gently, "but I understand why you didn't speak up. It's not easy going against what everyone else thinks." Margaret nodded, wiping her tears. "Still, I want you to know that I see you, Thomas. I see how hard you're working, how much effort you're putting into this, and I believe in you, even if no one else does." Her words struck a chord deep within him. For the first time since arriving, Thomas felt truly seen and valued, not because of what he looked like or what he could do, but simply because of who he was. Over the next few days, Margaret proved her sincerity. She encouraged him to take on tasks around the farm, praising his creativity and problem-solving skills. When he struggled, she offered guidance instead of criticism. Slowly but surely, Thomas began to feel like he belonged. The turning point came one rainy afternoon when the roof of the barn started leaking. Water dripped steadily onto the hay, threatening to ruin it. Margaret panicked, unsure of how to fix the problem. Without hesitation, Thomas sprang into action. Though his arms were still weak, he climbed onto the roof with determination, patching the holes with whatever materials he could find. By the time he climbed down, soaked to the bone but triumphant, Margaret was beaming with pride. "You saved us," she said, hugging him tightly. "You really are stronger than you look." From that day on, the dynamic between them shifted. Margaret no longer cared what the neighbors thought. She openly supported Thomas, defending him whenever anyone dared to criticize him. The children, inspired by their mother's confidence, grew even closer to him. Emily started calling him Uncle Thomas, while Jacob proudly declared that Thomas was teaching him how to be brave. Together, the four of them formed a bond that felt stronger than anything Thomas had ever known. Yet challenges still lay ahead. The farm required constant care and money remained tight. There were days when frustration bubbled over and moments when doubt crept back in. But through it all, Thomas held on to one truth. He had found a place where he was loved, not for his size, his strength, or his abilities, but for the person he was inside. And that, he realized, was worth more than anything. As the weeks turned into months, Thomas became more and more a part of the family. Margaret's farm was far from perfect. It needed constant work, and there were days when it felt like they were fighting an uphill battle. But together, they found ways to make things better. Thomas wasn't strong in the traditional sense. His arms weren't built for heavy lifting, and his body tired quickly under strain. But what he lacked in physical strength, he made up for with clever ideas and determination. He spent hours thinking of ways to improve their daily routines, often surprising Margaret with solutions she hadn't considered. One of his first big projects was fixing the old water pump near the barn. It had been broken for years, forcing Margaret and the children to carry buckets from the nearby stream every day, a task that took hours and left them exhausted. Thomas studied the pump carefully, tinkering with its rusted parts until late at night. Finally, after 3 days of trial and error, he managed to get it working again. The look of relief on Margaret's face when fresh water gushed out was something Thomas would never forget. "You've saved us so much time," she said, her voice filled with gratitude. For the first time, he felt truly useful, like he was contributing in a way that mattered. But it wasn't just practical improvements that brought them closer. It was the little moments, too. On quiet evenings, after the chores were done, Thomas would sit by the fireplace with Emily and Jacob, telling stories or teaching them simple games. Sometimes he'd sketch pictures of animals or landscapes in a notebook, showing the kids how to draw. They loved these lessons, especially Jacob, who proudly showed off his drawings to anyone who would look. Even Margaret joined in sometimes, laughing as Thomas turned their stick figure sketches into silly cartoons. These small acts of kindness helped bridge the gap between him and the children, turning them from strangers into a real family. Despite the growing bond, life on the farm was still hard. Money was tight, and there were months when they barely had enough to eat. Margaret worked tirelessly, selling eggs and vegetables at the market whenever she could, but it wasn't always enough. One particularly cold winter, when food supplies ran dangerously low, Thomas came up with an idea. He remembered seeing wild rabbits in the fields behind the house and decided to try trapping them. It wasn't easy. Rabbits were quick and cunning. But after several failed attempts, he finally caught one. That night, they roasted the rabbit over the fire, savoring every bite. It wasn't much, but it kept them going, and the meal brought them closer together. Through all the struggles, Margaret continued to support Thomas, defending him whenever outsiders criticized him. Word had spread through the town about the skinny mail-order husband, and some neighbors still mocked him openly. At first, Thomas tried to ignore their comments, but it wore on him. One day, while helping Margaret load hay onto a cart, a man passing by stopped to sneer, "Still think you're tough enough for this place?" The word stung, and Thomas clenched his fists, unsure of how to respond. Before he could say anything, Margaret stepped forward, her voice firm. "He works harder than anyone I know," she snapped. "And if you don't have anything nice to say, maybe you should keep walking." Her boldness shocked everyone, including Thomas. After the man walked away, red-faced and embarrassed, Margaret turned to Thomas with a sheepish smile. "I meant every word," she said simply. From that moment on, people began to see Thomas differently, or at least they stopped saying cruel things to his face. Margaret's unwavering support gave him the confidence to stand taller, even when others doubted him. Spring arrived, bringing with it new challenges and opportunities. The fields needed planting, and Margaret worried they wouldn't have enough seeds to cover everything. Thomas suggested they focus on high-yield crops like corn and potatoes, which could feed the family and provide extra to sell at the market. He also came up with the idea of using leftover scraps from last year's harvest to create compost, enriching the soil without spending money on fertilizer. Margaret was amazed by his resourcefulness, and though the work was backbreaking, they tackled it together side by side. The children pitched in too, learning the value of teamwork. Emily helped weed the garden, while Jacob chased away birds that tried to eat the newly planted seeds. Seeing them work so hard filled Thomas with pride. He realized that being a father wasn't about having muscles or brawn. It was about guiding, teaching, and loving. And in those moments, surrounded by Margaret and the kids, he felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be. As the crops began to grow, so did their hope for the future. The farm started producing more than it had in years, thanks to Thomas's innovations and Margaret's relentless effort. Neighbors who once ridiculed him now came to ask for advice on improving their own farms. Some even admitted, reluctantly, that they had misjudged him. Thomas didn't gloat or hold grudges, he simply smiled and offered help wherever he could. His kindness won people over, proving that action spoke louder than words. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Margaret and Thomas sat together on the porch. The air was warm, and the sound of crickets filled the silence. Margaret leaned her head against his shoulder, sighing contentedly. "We've come a long way," she said softly. Thomas nodded, wrapping an arm around her. "We make a good team," he replied. For the first time in his life, he felt truly accepted, not because he had changed who he was, but because someone had chosen to love him for exactly who he was. Yet deep down, Thomas knew their journey wasn't over. There would always be challenges ahead, and not everyone in town would fully accept him. But he no longer cared about pleasing everyone. What mattered most was the family he had built, the woman who believed in him, the children who trusted him, and the life they were creating together. As he looked out at the fields glowing in the fading sunlight, he felt a sense of peace wash over him. This was home. And for the first time, he knew he was enough. As summer approached, the farm flourished in ways no one had expected. The corn grew tall and green, swaying gently in the breeze, while rows of potatoes promised a bountiful harvest. Margaret often stood at the edge of the field, her hands on her hips, marveling at how far they had come. "I never thought we'd see such good crops, she said one morning as Thomas joined her. He smiled, wiping sweat from his brow. "Hard work pays off," he replied simply. But it wasn't just hard work. It was their combined efforts, their shared determination that made the difference. The children were thriving too. Emily had become more confident, helping Margaret with household chores and even teaching Jacob how to read using an old book Thomas had found in town. Jacob, once shy and hesitant, now followed Thomas around like a shadow, eager to learn everything he could. Whether it was fixing a broken fence or planting seeds in neat rows, Jacob wanted to be just like him. One afternoon, as they worked together in the vegetable garden, Jacob looked up at Thomas with wide eyes. "Do you think I'll be strong, like you when I grow up?" he asked. Thomas chuckled, ruffling the boy's hair. "You'll be stronger," he said, "because you've got your mom's heart." Margaret heard the exchange from the kitchen window and felt tears welling up in her eyes. She hadn't expected to find happiness again after losing her first husband. Life had been lonely and difficult for so long, but now with Thomas by her side, things felt lighter. Even the smallest joys, a meal shared together, laughter echoing through the house, felt monumental. She realized she didn't just need Thomas. She loved him. And though she hadn't said those words yet, she hoped he already knew. But life wasn't without its trials. As the weather grew hotter, drought became a real concern. Rain had been scarce for weeks, and the soil was starting to dry out. Without water, their precious crops would wither, undoing all their hard work. Margaret paced back and forth, wringing her hands. "What are we going to do?" she asked one evening as they sat at the table. Thomas leaned forward, his expression thoughtful. "We can dig trenches to guide whatever rain comes directly to the plants," he suggested. "And if it doesn't rain soon, maybe we can borrow a cart and fetch water from the stream." It was exhausting work, but they couldn't afford to give up. For days, Thomas and Margaret worked alongside each other, digging shallow trenches around the fields. Emily and Jacob helped too, carrying buckets of water from the pump to pour into the driest areas. Their hands blistered, their backs ached, and their faces were streaked with dirt, but they kept going. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, dark clouds gathered overhead, thunder rumbled in the distance, and the first drops of rain began to fall. They ran outside, laughing and cheering as the rain soaked them to the bone. Margaret spun in circles, arms outstretched, while the children danced barefoot in the mud. Thomas stood watching them, a smile spreading across his face. In that moment, he realized something important. Happiness wasn't about having everything perfect. It was about finding joy even in the toughest times, knowing you weren't alone. When Margaret finally stopped spinning and turned to look at him, breathless and glowing, he felt his heart swell with love. That night, as they dried off by the fire, Margaret decided to take a risk. She reached across the table and took Thomas's hand in hers, "I want to thank you," she began, her voice soft but steady. "Not just for saving the crops or helping with the kids, but for being here, for believing in us when others didn't." "You've changed our lives, Thomas." Her words caught him off guard, and for a moment he didn't know what to say. Then he squeezed her hand gently. "You saved me too," he admitted. "Before I came here, I didn't think anyone would ever see me for who I am. But you did. You always have." Their relationship deepened after that conversation. They started spending more time together, sharing stories late into the night or taking quiet walks under the stars. Margaret told Thomas about her late husband, speaking fondly of the man he had been and the life they had built before tragedy struck. Thomas listened intently, feeling honored that she trusted him enough to share these memories. In return, he opened up about his own past, the loneliness he had felt in his hometown, the dreams he had almost given up on. By sharing their pain and hopes, they grew closer than ever. The farm continued to improve, thanks in large part to Thomas's ingenuity. He built a small windmill to pump water more efficiently, reducing the amount of manual labor needed. He also introduced crop rotation, explaining to Margaret how it would keep the soil healthy year after year. Neighbors who had once doubted him now sought his advice, impressed by his knowledge and dedication. Some even offered to help during busy seasons, bringing food or lending tools. Slowly but surely, the community began to accept him, not because he proved himself physically strong, but because he showed them the value of perseverance and kindness. One day, as they prepared for the upcoming harvest festival, Margaret surprised Thomas with a gift. It was a new shirt, stitched carefully by hand. "You deserve something nice," she said, blushing slightly as she handed it to him. Thomas held it up, admiring the fine stitching. "This is beautiful," he said sincerely. "Thank you." That evening, as he tried it on, the children giggled, saying he looked handsome. Margaret watched silently, her heart full. She realized she wanted this moment to last forever, to build a future with Thomas, not just as a partner, but as a true companion. The harvest festival arrived, bringing the entire town together. There were games, music, and plenty of food. For the first time, Thomas felt like he belonged. People greeted him warmly, thanking him for his contributions to the community. Children ran up to him, asking him to join their races or tell them stories. Margaret stood nearby, watching with pride. When the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the festivities, the mayor announced a special award for someone who had made a significant impact on the town. To everyone's surprise, the recipient was Thomas. As he stepped forward to accept the wooden plaque engraved with his name, the crowd erupted into applause. Margaret beamed, her eyes shining with tears. Thomas stammered a short speech thanking everyone for their support and crediting Margaret for inspiring him. "I'm not the strongest person here," he admitted, "but I've learned that strength isn't always about muscles. It's about working together, supporting each other, and never giving up, even when things seem impossible." His words resonated deeply, earning another round of cheers. After the ceremony, as fireworks lit up the night sky, Margaret pulled Thomas aside. "I'm proud of you," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "You've shown everyone and yourself that you're more than enough." Thomas wrapped his arms around her, holding her close. For the first time in his life, he felt truly whole. He had found not just acceptance but love, a love that celebrated him for who he was inside and out. Though challenges still lay ahead, Thomas knew they could face anything as long as they had each other. The farm, the family, the community. They were all proof that sometimes the greatest victories come from the simplest acts of courage and faith. And as he stood there, surrounded by the people who mattered most, he felt grateful for every step of the journey that had brought him here. As autumn settled in, the air grew crisp, and the leaves turned brilliant shades of red, orange, and yellow. The farm was alive with activity as they prepared for the harvest. It was a busy but joyful time, filled with long days of work and evenings spent celebrating small victories. Thomas had never imagined he could feel so content. Every morning he woke up to the sound of birds chirping and the smell of fresh earth. Margaret would already be in the kitchen, cooking breakfast while the children played outside. Life wasn't perfect. It still demanded hard work and sacrifice, but it felt good, real and fulfilling. One chilly morning, as they gathered around the table, Margaret announced her plan to expand the garden next spring. "We've got enough space," she said, pointing to an unused corner of the yard. "If we plant more vegetables, we can sell even more at the market." Thomas nodded enthusiastically, already thinking of ways to improve the soil and maximize their yield. Emily chimed in excitedly, saying she wanted to grow flowers too so they could sell bouquets alongside the vegetables. Jacob, ever eager to help, declared he would dig all the holes himself. Margaret laughed, shaking her head. "You'll need some help with that," she teased. The warmth in her voice made Thomas smile. It was moments like these that reminded him how lucky he was. But not everything went smoothly. A few weeks later, disaster struck when a storm rolled in unexpectedly. Dark clouds loomed overhead and strong winds tore through the fields, flattening parts of the corn crop. Margaret panicked, rushing outside with Thomas close behind. Together they tried to salvage what they could, propping up stalks and tying them together with string. The children joined in, doing their best despite the chaos. By the time the storm passed, they were soaked and exhausted, but they refused to give up. Over the next few days, they worked tirelessly to repair the damage, knowing that every ear of corn counted. The setback tested their strength, but it also brought them closer. Margaret noticed how Thomas stayed calm under pressure, offering solutions instead of giving in to frustration. He reminded her of her late husband in some ways, his quiet resilience, his ability to find hope even in difficult times. Yet he was different too, bringing his own unique qualities to the family. She realized she didn't just admire him, she loved him deeply, in a way that felt new and yet completely natural. One evening, after putting the kids to bed, she sat beside him on the porch. "I don't know what I'd do without you," she admitted softly. Thomas reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. "You'll never have to find out," he replied. With the harvest season winding down, the family focused on preparing for winter. They stored potatoes and onions in the root cellar, hung dried herbs from the ceiling, and chopped firewood to keep the house warm. Thomas took charge of fixing anything that needed repairs: the roof, the fence, the barn door, ensuring everything was ready for the cold months ahead. Margaret marveled at his resourcefulness, often teasing him about being a fix-it wizard. He laughed, brushing off the compliment, but secretly he was proud of himself. For so long he had doubted his worth, wondering if he could ever measure up. Now he knew he didn't have to be the strongest or the smartest, he just had to care. The community continued to rally around them, offering support whenever needed. Neighbors who had once ridiculed Thomas now treated him with respect, even admiration. When word spread about the storm damage, several people came by to lend a hand, helping replant sections of the field. Others brought food or offered to watch the kids so Margaret and Thomas could focus on repairs. It was a reminder that kindness begets kindness, and that people are capable of change when given a chance. Thomas appreciated their help, but what touched him most was seeing how much they trusted him now. He had earned their respect not by proving himself physically strong, but by showing up, day after day, and doing what needed to be done. Winter arrived sooner than expected, blanketing the farm in snow. The world outside seemed frozen, quiet, and still, but inside the house, life buzzed with warmth and laughter. The children loved playing in the snow, building forts and having snowball fights, while Margaret baked pies and stews to keep everyone fed. Thomas spent hours teaching Emily and Jacob how to carve wooden toys, using scraps left over from his repair projects. The house smelled of pine and cinnamon, and the fireplace crackled steadily, casting flickering shadows on the walls. It was during these cozy moments that Thomas realized how much he cherished this family, not just because they accepted him, but because they celebrated him for who he truly was. One snowy afternoon, Margaret surprised Thomas with a special project. She handed him a box wrapped in brown paper, tied with twine, Open it, she urged, smiling mischievously. Inside he found a stack of letters, notes she had written to him over the past few months expressing her gratitude and love. Some were short and sweet, others longer and more detailed, but each one carried her heartfelt words. I wanted you to know how much you mean to us, she explained, her cheeks flushing pink. Thomas was speechless, overwhelmed by the gesture. He hugged her tightly, whispering, "Thank you," over and over again. Their bond deepened further as they faced another challenge. Illness struck the household. First, Jacob came down with a fever, followed quickly by Emily. Margaret nursed, them day and night, barely sleeping herself. Thomas helped where he could, fetching water, chopping firewood, and keeping the house warm. Despite their exhaustion, they supported each other, taking turns caring for the children. When the fever finally broke and the kids began to recover, they both collapsed into chairs, utterly drained but relieved. We did it, Margaret said weakly, leaning her head against Thomas's shoulder. Together. As the days grew shorter and colder, Thomas reflected on how far they had come. When he first arrived at the farm, he had been unsure of himself, questioning whether he belonged. Now he couldn't imagine life without Margaret and the children. They weren't just a family. They were his purpose, his reason to keep going. And though there would always be challenges ahead, he knew they could face anything as long as they stood side by side. On New Year's Eve, as the clock ticked closer to midnight, the family gathered around the fireplace. Margaret poured hot cider into mugs and they toasted to the year ahead. To new beginnings, she said, raising her mug. Thomas smiled, clinking his cup against hers. And to sticking together no matter what, he added. As the fire crackled and the children giggled, he felt a profound sense of peace. This was home, a place where love triumphed over judgment, where strength came not from physical power but from the heart. And for the first time in his life, Thomas knew he was exactly where he was meant to be. Spring returned to the farm, bringing with it a sense of renewal and hope. The snow melted away, revealing fields ready for planting and trees budding with fresh leaves. Thomas stood at the edge of the property one morning, breathing in the crisp air and feeling a deep sense of gratitude. Over the past year, he had grown in ways he never imagined, physically, emotionally, and spiritually. He was no longer the same man who had arrived at the train station, nervous and unsure of his place in the world. Now he belonged to this family, this land, and this life. Margaret walked up beside him, her hands tucked into the pockets of her worn coat. "What are you thinking about?" she asked softly, her eyes scanning the horizon. Thomas smiled, glancing at her. "Just how far we've come," he replied. Margaret nodded, leaning into him slightly. "It hasn't been easy, but I wouldn't trade it for anything." Her words echoed his own thoughts. Together, they had faced storms, both literal and figurative, and emerged stronger on the other side. The farm was thriving. The children were happy, and their bond as a family felt unshakable. The kids were growing up quickly, each day bringing new milestones. Emily, now 11, took charge of many household tasks, helping Margaret cook meals and mend clothes. She often joked that she would run the farm someday, and though she said it with a laugh, there was a spark of determination in her eyes. Jacob, nearly 8, idolized Thomas more than ever. Whether it was learning how to fix tools or practicing his aim with a slingshot, Jacob wanted to follow in his footsteps. One afternoon, as they worked side by side repairing a fence, Jacob looked up at Thomas with admiration. "You're my hero," he declared. Thomas chuckled, ruffling the boy's hair. "And you're mine," he said honestly. Life wasn't without its challenges, of course. Money was still tight, and there were days when the workload felt overwhelming. But what made all the difference was their teamwork. Margaret and Thomas balanced each other perfectly. She handled the details while he focused on big ideas, always finding solutions to problems. When a neighbor's cow fell ill and threatened to spread disease to their livestock, Thomas built a temporary pen far from the main barn. When supplies ran low at the market, Margaret bartered cleverly, trading eggs and vegetables for flour and sugar. Their partnership was seamless, built on trust and mutual respect. As the weeks passed, Margaret began noticing subtle changes in Thomas. His confidence had grown. He carried himself with a quiet assurance that hadn't been there before. People in town no longer whispered about him being too skinny or questioned his abilities. Instead, they sought his advice on farming techniques or praised his resourcefulness. Margaret knew how much this meant to him. For years, he had struggled with self-doubt, wondering if he was good enough. Now he didn't need to prove himself to anyone, not even to himself. He simply was. One sunny afternoon, as they sat together, under the shade of an old oak tree, Margaret decided to share something she had been thinking about for a long time. "Thomas," she began hesitantly, "do you remember when you first came here? You told me you weren't sure if anyone would ever see you for who you truly are." Thomas nodded, meeting her gaze. "I remember," he said quietly. Margaret reached for his hand, her fingers intertwining with his. "Well, I want you to know, I see you, all of you, your kindness, your strength, your heart, and I love you." Her words hung in the air, simple yet profound. Thomas felt a lump rise in his throat, emotion welling up inside him. For so long he had searched for acceptance, longing to be seen beyond his appearance. Now, sitting here with Margaret, surrounded by the beauty of the farm and the laughter of the children playing nearby, he realized he had found something even better: love. Not just romantic love, but a deep, abiding connection that transcended judgment and embraced imperfection. He squeezed her hand tightly, unable to speak for a moment. Finally, he managed to whisper, "I love you too." Their relationship continued to flourish, strengthened by honesty and vulnerability. They talked openly about their fears, dreams, and hopes for the future. Margaret confided in Thomas about her worries as a mother, how she wanted the best for Emily and Jacob, but feared she might not be able to provide everything they needed. Thomas listened patiently, offering reassurance. "You're doing an amazing job," he told her. "They're lucky to have you." In return, he shared his own insecurities, admitting that sometimes he still doubted whether he could live up to the role of father and husband. Margaret hugged him fiercely. "You already are," she said firmly, "every single day." The community noticed the change in them too. Once dismissed as outsiders, they were now pillars of the town. Neighbors turned to them for guidance, knowing they could count on Thomas's ingenuity and Margaret's wisdom. At church gatherings and festivals, people greeted them warmly, treating them like family. Even those who had once mocked Thomas now spoke highly of him, acknowledging the value he brought to the community. It was a testament to the power of perseverance and kindness, a reminder that actions speak louder than words. As summer approached, the farm entered its busiest season. Crops grew tall and green, promising another bountiful harvest. Margaret and Thomas worked tirelessly alongside the children, tending to the fields and preparing for market days. Yet amidst the busyness, they made time for small joys: a picnic by the stream, an evening spent stargazing, or simply holding hands as they watched the sunset. These moments mattered more than anything else, grounding them in the present and reminding them of what truly mattered. On a warm June evening, after a long day of work, Margaret surprised Thomas with a special gift. She led him to the porch, where a wooden plaque hung proudly on the wall. Carved into it were the words, "Our home." Beneath them, smaller letters spelled out, "Built with love." Tears welled up in Thomas's eyes as he read the inscription. "This is perfect," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Margaret smiled, wrapping her arms around him. "It's ours," she said softly. "Everything we've worked for, everything we've built, it's because of us. Together." That night, as they sat together under the stars, Thomas reflected on his journey. From the loneliness of his hometown to the warmth of this family, he had traveled a long road. There had been pain and doubt along the way, but also growth and discovery. Most importantly, he had found love. not just from others, but within himself. He realized now that being too skinny didn't define him. What defined him was his heart, his resilience, and his willingness to keep trying, no matter what. Margaret rested her head on his shoulder, gazing up at the sky. "Do you think we'll have more challenges ahead?" she asked thoughtfully. Thomas nodded. "Of course. Life isn't easy, but I also think we'll have more joy, more laughter, and more reasons to celebrate." Margaret smiled, squeezing his hand. "As long as we have each other, I'm not afraid of anything." Thomas kissed the top of her head, feeling a profound sense of peace. She was right. They had built something extraordinary, something worth fighting for. In the end, Thomas understood that true happiness wasn't about perfection. It was about finding people who accepted you for who you were, flaws and all. It was about working together, supporting one another, and creating a life filled with purpose and love. As he looked out at the fields bathed in moonlight, listening to the crickets chirp and the distant sound of the children's laughter drifting through the window, he knew he had found exactly that. This was his home, his family, his life. And for the first time, he felt completely whole.